Jimmy again. Okay, so back to Text Wrangler and looking at some actual HTML, hypertext markup language. Hypertext meaning links, markup meaning will surround phrases and sentences and paragraphs with tags that the browser will interpret, and language because I think it's because it's a language. In this case, by the way, this is of course a like data language, not one that you would speak, and not a programming language either. It's not meant to actually have an algorithm associated with it. It's more like adding metadata or similar to how we put records in a database for our library information system. So HTML is much more akin to working with like marked records, that kind of thing, than it is to writing a program. Certainly more like marked records than a spoken language, since it isn't one. Sorry, Diet Coke. So you see here the most basic page from chapter 1. And I want to start with the thing at the very, very top. Notice, by the way, one of the things I love about Text Wrangler are the line numbers. Later on, if you were, let's say you were going to take another course, or maybe you're going to teach yourself JavaScript or PHP or a more involved web programming language, often when you have an error, the program you use or the website will tell you there's an error on line blah, blah, blah. So I think it's a good idea to have line numbers. You can also, if you're working with another person asynchronously or maybe over the phone, you can say things like, look at line 9 and this thing on line 9, that kind of thing. So line numbers are very beneficial. I also mentioned earlier that I like Text Wrangler because it has color highlighting, sometimes called syntax highlighting, color coding, so that browsers and data inside the browsers or the text that'll be displayed, all of that looks different, so that just by having the colors there, I can get information about what the code is, what it's supposed to be doing, that kind of thing. So at the very top here is something called the doc type. In HTML4 and all the other ones before that, the doc type was long and complicated. In HTML5, which we're using here, it is pretty darn simple. And I know it looks strange, exclamation point doc type HTML, but what we're basically doing is we're promising the browser, once it gets this code, once it comes from the server or from your desktop or whatever into the browser, we're telling the browser, hey look, we're going to be HTML. So whatever rules, web browser, you know for interpreting HTML, find those and have them handy. Okay? And then on the next line is the HTML tag, and I'm going to actually hit this little triangle right here. One of the cool things about Text Wrangler is it lets me collapse code, and you see the weird ellipsis there. That's everything in the page. This is what I mean by markup. In between the tag HTML and /HTML is the entire website. So the entire website is being marked as HTML, and in this case specifically as English. So you'll notice in the back of the book there's a 2-letter abbreviation for many, many languages that a web browser is actually capable of understanding, meaning that if it was if it had strange marks on it that maybe you're not used to, like maybe it's, say, Hebrew or Sanskrit or Tagalog. There we go. I had to think of a nice Asian one that's not Mandarin. The browser actually can try to interpret the way to display those particular characters. That's why that lang is there. I write in English, so there it is. Okay? Okay, now I'm going to hit the little triangle here and here. Let's minimize those two. So this, even though it's not helpful in the grand scheme of things, this is what every website should actually look like this. A doc type, HTML at the beginning and end, a head, which is meant to be where the title is displayed and some other kind of background information, and a body, which is where everything else is displayed. So if I switch over to Firefox, by the way, I'm doing that with Command-Tab. You can switch rapidly between open applications on the Mac, kind of like Alt-Tab on a Windows computer. Anyway, so the body is what shows up inside the actual, it's just everything that's, has a background of white. The head is actually where you get the title from, which is how the tab, like what words are displayed in the tab when you're looking at a website. And there's some other information in the head too. Okay, back to Text Wrangler. As a matter of fact, the only two things that we're going to have in our head portion of the HTML right now is the character set, in this case UTF-8, and the title. And notice that title has an opening and closing tag, but the little meta thing does not. And anything you put inside title, the browser tries to display along the top there. If you have multiple tabs, it'll show up along in the tab. You can't put any other markup in here, so I can't say make this word blue or that word italics. I can't make this a link. It has to be just plain text. The only markup that can be on this line is title and slash title. All the rest of the stuff has to be just normal text. Okay, let's talk about the character set very briefly, because if you're using a Windows computer, your text editor may want to change the character set to something like Windows-ISO, something complicated. UTF-8 means normal, average, everyday Unicode, which is the, I did a video earlier about the World Wide Web Consortium being kind of like the United Nations for the web. Unicode is kind of like the United Nations for how to display text, and I mean how to display text on a phone, on a computer, inside a web browser. Unicode is the computer science sort of standard that includes not only English characters and characters that you might see in, say, Europe, but every language that can be displayed on a computer. So Unicode is very expansive. And by using character set UTF-8, you're basically allowing your HTML to display any character set that can be displayed on the web. You'll notice, if maybe you've seen this before, I'm just going to go off script and we're going to go to Wikipedia, if I can spell it, and search for, oh, I don't know, Mandarin. Except I misspelled it. Look, it fixed it for me. It's clever of it. Yes, thank you, Wikipedia. And is that where I was before? You'll see that, like, here's an example of a character that can be displayed in Unicode that if I were using one of the Windows-specific character sets, it wouldn't actually display. As a matter of fact, I see, here I'm going to zoom in again with the Control Plus. I saw some other characters in there besides just Mandarin somewhere in there. Well, at any rate. So here's an example of like a chunk of text, like the A with the mark over it from Pinyin, that sort of thing. And the, I don't even, Portuguese, Tomé Pires. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but that's okay. Notice that any of the things that as an English speaker I might not know how to do with my keyboard, if the content already has those characters in it, my HTML can actually display it without having to do anything different. So as a matter of fact, if I were to say copy and paste this text, since Wikipedia uses UTF-8, I could actually paste it into my text editor and it will maintain whatever weird character display it had before. So if you have a program that can, say, write Mandarin characters in plain text, you could copy them and paste them right into your text editor. That's what UTF-8 is for. And you'll notice all his and her. I'm not even sure who writes which of the examples, but you'll notice that their examples all use UTF-8, so I will too. Okay, so I went ahead and expanded the body tag. Notice that everything else is inside the body tag, okay? The three basic structures, HTML, head, and body. Body's going to have paragraphs and images and menus and tables and everything else, okay? Okay, before I dive into the guts here, I want to talk about article. HTML5 has semantics that supersedes, or I guess goes farther than, that's probably a better way to say it, the semantics of previous HTML versions. And what I mean by that is, it's got the ability to mark off an area of a website with particular meaning. And it may not just change the way it's displayed in the browser at all. For example, if I were to take away this tag article/article, the content in the browser would actually show up the same. But what I'm doing is I'm adding metadata to this particular chunk of HTML. I'm telling the browser and anything that might use my web page besides my browser that all of the stuff in between lines 8 and 17, all of that is meant to go together. That's one article, okay? And there are several different semantic breakdowns in the chapter there. Article is one of them. There's one for things like addresses. There's one for navigation bars. So you'll notice that there are lots of these little sort of divider tags that don't actually change the way they display inside the browser, but they're meant to add metadata so that later on, if I wanted my style sheet to make articles look one way and addresses look another, I could actually change that. Or if someone is using a screen reader for maybe they have accessibility issues, a screen reader can actually take the metadata that I add to my HTML and make the page easier to read for someone with that sort of disability. So you'll notice that there's a lot in the first 4 chapters about semantics and tags. So watch that carefully and you know, reread it if you need to. Okay, so everything from 8 to 17 is meant to be kind of one piece of information, one article. In this case, it's all about this flower, the blue flax. Okay, a couple other things, and then we'll cut this one short. There are things in HTML there's tags specifically for making headings, and in HTML5, the heading is actually very important. It adds a sort of a structural piece to the website that, although it would have done the same thing in other versions of HTML, the heading is meant to say this is the first thing, say, a search engine should look for. So this H1 right here, which is going to show up in black bold text on its own line, let's go back and look at it. The H1 actually tells things like screen readers again, or Google, that this describes what this particular article is about. In this case, it's the only article on this website or on this web page. So this one web page, this is the main thing. And so when a search engine is making, say, an index of content, that H1 is going to be very important. So you'll notice we're starting a theme here. As information professionals, it's our job when we make a web page to make sure it's structured correctly, that it's indexed correctly, that the semantics can help, say, a screen reader or a search engine format your page and structure your page correctly. So there's a lot of this sort of tags that don't seem to have a visual effect but have a sort of a structural effect. Okay, I'm not going to get into how the image tag works, but there's an image tag. I'll do a little video on those later. But I do want to point out that there's a heading here, and then under that's an image tag, and then under that is something called a paragraph. So everything I've highlighted from lines 11 to 14 is a paragraph, and you'll notice that my text editor again gave me a little triangle to collapse that whole thing. Okay, and there's another paragraph there. So there's also a reference here to a special character called @copy semicolon, and if we look back at it, it's the copyright symbol. For the most part, these special HTML characters have been replaced by Unicode. The fact that we use UTF-8, if somebody's going to write in Mandarin, their computer probably has the capacity to write those characters already. But there are some leftover special characters, like copyright is one of them, that if you need to print the copyright symbol, well, there's HTML has this thing built into it. So the basic structure of a website is going to have the skeleton that you saw there, and there'll be tags that mark off pages or mark off content, and some of them have an opening and a closing, like H1 and /H1, and some don't. Like image doesn't have a closing part, it's just one particular tag. Okay? I cut this one off too. I kind of shortened it a bit, so there'll be more coming.